one of the learnings from early ventures, or one of the learnings from working with clients, I have clients who are even over 20 years stayed with me, and I've seen progression of companies right from a very smaller size. I was working with a cafe who was at the time 5 cafes, and today there are about, I think, 5,000 of them around the world. So I've seen those progressions as to what it's taken to build these companies, to build these ventures. And one of the things that stayed with me is a term that I use a lot. I ended up doing a PhD on that, is do companies have the ability to strategize creatively, right? A lot of what management theories exist, for example, the best of business schools and stuff, the reason they were created, right? 1950s, Harvard was created, or the other business schools came in. Their objective at that time was to normalize industrialization, right? It was MBAs are essentially called Masters of Business Administration. So the job of a business school was really administration. And they formalized theories and concepts and ideas which would become predictable so that the shop floor can become predictable. And that's largely the way the curriculums and education has evolved. And what I've realized working with clients is, because we are rooted so much in what works, the best practices, and this is what worked in Google, and this is what worked in Apple, we diminish our ability to actually imagine strategy, and we rather borrow it and make it predictable. There's nothing wrong with being predictable, but if you are predictable and you're following a predictable path, you can't be expecting a breakthrough result. So as long as you're okay with that you want to be predictable and you want to have a predictable return on your growth or investment or career or salaries, you're perfectly fine. The problem is entrepreneurs don't want predictable returns. They want outsized growth. They want outsized returns. And which is where one of the things that they need to do is develop the ability to be creative at the level of strategy itself. What is it that I am presenting to the market? What is it I'm positioning in the market? How am I structured? What's the business model? Is there creativity in it? Is there innovation in it? If not, then at best, the best case scenario will be a predictable result. And you shouldn't question it. You should be happy with it. I tell people, if you're unable to imagine, or if you're unable to innovate, right, which is a lot of us. There's a mental block. We can't think. We're so much into our businesses or into our lives that it's very difficult to imagine what's the way out. So I often tell people, if you don't do anything, and if you don't know anything, and you're not able to think of anything, just do the opposite of what you're doing. That's automatically an innovation. Now, your worst case scenario will be that there will be an effort that failed. The best case will be that it might just blow up. You won't know. The problem is that we try to second guess it, thinking that we know. So the moment we are in this position of I know, that's the end of innovation, because you already know. So begin with I don't know, begin with experimentation, and if you're completely dead of imagination, then just do the opposite. It's still innovation. So it's critical in your head to define what failure actually is, right? Is failure to you an idea that doesn't work? Is failure to you a business that doesn't work? Is failure to you a financial loss? Is failure to you an image loss? Or is it more personal? So to me, how I dealt with it, and of course I felt terrible about all the failures that I've gone through, but how I dealt with it, and I don't know where that came from, was just move on to the next one, right? So something didn't work and stuff, but so I never took it personally in a sense. Of course it hurts and you feel bad about it, but you've got to very quickly move on. There is only one way where you can avoid failure, which is don't try anything at all. So don't try, won't fail. But if you will try, there will be things that will fail. As an entrepreneur, there are more failures than successes. It's just the magnitude differentiates. And that's really the way that you got to contextualize it. The problem is the language. We've associated words like failure and dejection and results and loss, and it's just vocabulary. You just got to shift it. Again, do the opposite vocabulary in your head and make a shift of it, because it's just about perspective. You got to move on with innovation, with trying new things, trying new strategies. Of course, because it's new, it takes an extra effort to make it work. And there will be So it takes extra effort to make it work. Now, does it mean that let's say it takes 90 days to make it work, and for 89 days it didn't work? If you're going to feel that for 89 days you failed, you won't wait to see the 90th day. So it's very important to separate what is a failure from what is a process of success. And I think that's the critical vocabulary distinction for the head. Some people will tend to use a lot more openness and imagination in their strategies and ideas and business models. And then there is a school of thought, which I think where people like to be predictable. Once you've achieved a certain level of success, I think your appetite for innovation goes down because you want to preserve it. And that preservation actually kills innovation until you realize that now this has reached a ceiling, and then people start searching, okay, what can be my next thing and where can be my next leap? And the cure to that is keep designing for it and keep disrupting it yourself until someone else does it for you or to you. So there are companies who are open about it, and there are people in their companies who are very fearful and just very rigid about it. And they're not rigid because they can't imagine or they can't innovate. They're rigid because they're scared. They're rigid because the psychology of the fear to preserve and prevent overrules the psychology to actually innovate and see a different result. Well, my PhD journey was very interesting. I did my PhD in a combination of creativity and strategy, right? It's a field that no one's merged before, and that was my foray into this. And very interestingly, when I started doing my PhD and I started researching on all these wonderful creative people and creativity literature and the genius literature, people like Einstein and John Nash and all, to understand as to what their minds worked like, I never till that moment realized that I was actually in the creative business. I'm articulating it today, and I'm talking about 20 years ago how I encouraged companies to innovate and be creative, but I never realized I was in that business. I'm able to articulate it today because I happen to do and read about or learn about creativity and strategy in it. And the journey of that particular thing was to go in depth into drawing connections between what creative ideas produce strategic outcomes, right? And that was the depth of the model that I went into, studying different companies, different cultures, different countries, that every strategic success can be linked to some creative idea, may or may not be yours, right? Someone else might be talking about it and presenting it to you, and you might have taken the business out of it. But every strategic success, every kind of success has some creative idea in it. Otherwise, it can't be built, right? So whatever stands, and the other thing that companies confuse, or businesses or even people confuse, as to what we understand out of being creative itself, right? We think creativity is about producing an idea, or creativity is about thinking of something new, or thinking of something entirely wild, so to say, and people associate creativity with that. But actual creativity is not about any of that. It's a very silent process. How is a person being creative? And no one can answer that. You only see the output, right? Once you see the output, very easy to judge whether that was creative, whether that was innovative, whether that was good, whether that was bad. The biggest silent phenomenon is we don't know the process of being creative, right? Does it happen in the mind? Does it happen verbally? Does it happen as a flash? Is it even a thinking process? Can you think yourself into creativity? We don't know. Right? If you could, then ChatGPT would be the most creative thing because it's a thinking tool. So we don't really know. And because we don't know is where the fear also belongs. Because we don't know, there's unpredictability and stuff. We're uneasy about being in the state of flow. We're uneasy about something new. We want safe and predictable and normalized paths to unpredictable returns, and it doesn't exist. We seem to think it's a new phenomenon that people have shorter attention spans. I don't think it's a new thing at all. People always had short attention spans. Earlier days, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in the days of newspapers, it was about headlines, right? People used to say, if your headline doesn't make an impact, then no one's going to read the article. That's still true. It's just the medium of headline has shifted out of the newspaper and onto a small screen. You had 3 seconds to sell a newspaper. You have 3 seconds to sell an advertisement. You have 3 seconds to sell a business. And this is where it becomes crucial. If in those 3 seconds, you are doing something which is comparable, people are going to scroll. If you're doing something that they've seen before, they're going to scroll. If you pick up a newspaper, you see a headline which you read yesterday, you're not going to pick it up, right? It's the same thing. Is there something different? Can you capture imagination in 3 to 10 seconds? And how do you capture that imagination is by being incomparable. The moment people can compare you means they've seen it before and it's not going to make sense. So whether it's an advertisement, it's a story, it's a business, even a business model, is there something incomparable? It doesn't have to be wildly incomparable, but is there something unique, something incomparable, something novel, something innovative? If not, even if people spend 3 hours instead of 3 seconds, they're not going to do business with you because it's just the same.